Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's iconic detective Sherlock Holmes had surprising views about the countryside. As he patiently explained to Watson, crimes are more often noticed and reported in towns and cities due to the denser population and the pressure of public opinion. In rural areas, on the other hand, crime can often occur unseen. In Holmes's words, "Look at these lonely houses, each in its own fields, filled for the most part with poor ignorant folk who know little of the law. Think of the deeds of hellish cruelty, the hidden wickedness which may go on year in, year out in such places, and none the wiser." As if to illustrate his point, 32-year-old Frederick Morse was out walking in the fields of Somerset on a cold day in February 1933, the brisk wind whipping his face and the hunger stirring in his belly. He went to check on his rabbit traps, hoping he could take something home for dinner, but his attention was momentarily caught by a flash of chestnut and green as two pheasants scurried past, their long tails bobbing behind them. Morse cursed to himself, wishing he'd brought his gun so that the family could dine like kings that night. He was distracted as he ruminated over a predicament that had recently appeared in his life. He was wasting his time with game. Instead, he needed to think of a plan to dispatch a larger prey. Hello and welcome to Prasha's Murder Map. In this episode, we'll explore the case of a little-known murder that took place in a small village called Curry Mallet in Somerset in the 1930s. The details were only briefly mentioned in the newspapers at the time, with some of the more squalid elements never being disclosed by the press to avoid prejudicing the case. Much of the information I found on this true crime case comes from the trial notes kept by the killer's defence barrister, J.D Casswell. This murder may have been quick to slip from the memories of the public, but Casswell would never forget it. Joshua Casswell, KC, or King's Counsel, had defended many unsavoury characters in his time at the bar, although few of them had been accused of murder. When he was engaged on one of his early capital cases in 1933, he embarked on his work with enthusiasm, but once he had been briefed on all the sordid details, he knew that its abhorrent nature would linger in his mind for years afterwards. It is amazing what types of people one sometimes has to defend in our criminal courts, he later wrote with a shudder when reflecting on the case of 32-year-old Frederick Morse. By the end of a long and storied career lasting more than 3 decades, Casswell had defended 40 clients accused of capital offences, of whom only 5 were hanged. He developed a reputation for being involved in lurid cases, but always said that he disliked the sensationalism associated with them, and that he preferred the calmer atmosphere of civil courts. Frederick Morse lived in the village of Curry Mallet, 7 miles east of Taunton in the West Country, where he worked as a labourer for the Great Western Railway and later as a quarryman. He had 3 sisters and a brother, and even as an adult, he continued to live with his father Albert and mother Alice. Curry Mallet was, and still is, a tiny parish between the Blackdown Hills and the Somerset Levels, with a rich farming heritage and a minuscule population, which numbered less than 200 people at the time. Morse had already shown signs of abnormal behaviour as a child, as he had begun an incestuous relationship with his older sister Lily. Lily later married a man named Frank Brewer, with whom she had at least 6 children, although some records say they had 7. But sometime thereafter, she resumed intimate relations with her brother and fell pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Doris, sometimes known as Dorothy, who had the rare and unenviable distinction of being Frederick Morse's daughter and niece simultaneously. Doris was given the surname Brewer, so most people assumed that she was Frank's child. It's unclear whether or not Frank Brewer himself knew that the latest addition to their household had not sprung from his own loins and was the result of his wife's incestuous union with her brother, but it's possible that he discovered the truth, as by the age of 7, Doris was no longer living with the Brewers and was staying with her maternal grandparents, the man who was both her father and her uncle. Nobody seemed overly concerned by Frederick's uncontrolled carnality, as he was allowed to share a bedroom with his daughter. By the time she was 12 in 1933, Doris too had fallen victim to his sexual deviance. Her mother suspected that she had been raped and took her to the doctor, who confirmed that she was in an advanced state of pregnancy. As a sturdily built and well-developed girl, her condition had gone unnoticed for some time, and people remarked that she looked more like a 15 or 16-year-old. Eventually, her rapidly swelling belly drew the attention of the other children at the village school, and they bullied her so cruelly for her pregnancy that she stopped attending lessons and pleaded with Frederick to take her somewhere far away, apparently unaware that there was anything wrong with the fact that she was expecting a child at such a young age by her own father. On the afternoon of Thursday, 23rd of February 1933, father and daughter were seen walking arm in arm away from Curry Mallet. A witness named Daisy Burt was sitting in her front garden when she observed them going past, and remarked later that they looked like an ordinary couple. But she noticed that the girl kept turning around while the man appeared to be pulling her by the arm. The girl was carrying some kind of attaché case, presumably for her school books. Had Daisy been close enough to overhear their conversation, she might have noticed that Morse's mood was buoyant, and he was encouraging Doris with optimistic plans for their future, including the idea of having a house of their own. Frederick and Doris stopped at an inn, where they drank beer and lemonade respectively, and shortly afterwards arrived at a field where Morse told his daughter that he needed to inspect some rabbit traps. She innocently followed, unaware that her father and the father of her own unborn child had a more malevolent idea in mind. As they walked near the river and raindrops began to fall from the dark and lowering sky, he suddenly grabbed the pregnant girl and threw her down onto the muddy bank, then sexually assaulted her. Afterwards, he picked her up and flung her into the river, knowing full well that she couldn't swim. He turned away, without even bothering to watch the swirling water swallow her up. After dark, Morse returned home, soaked to the skin and alone. Noticing Doris's absence, his mother inquired suspiciously, "You haven't done anything to her, have you?" "I know nothing about it." "I'm innocent," Morse replied, but failed to furnish his family with an explanation as to where she could have gone. He seemed strangely unmoved by his daughter's disappearance, but the rest of the family grew concerned as the evening wore on, and they decided to inform the police. In the early hours of the morning, there was a robust knock at the door, and Morse opened it to find a member of the Somerset Constabulary standing outside, asking him to accompany them to Taunton Police Station. Once there, Morse was questioned by an inspector about Doris's whereabouts. He explained that Doris had been distraught earlier that day and had expressed a desire to commit suicide, saying, "Let's go and get out of it all." Morse claimed that he had tried to dissuade her and invited her to join him in the field where he was going to inspect his rabbit traps to take her mind off her troubles, as she had refused to go to school that morning. Morse himself had also failed to turn up for work at the quarry. When they reached the field, the weather was turning inclement, and the river was overflowing from the rain, so Frederick had urged Doris to take shelter in a shed at the top of the field. After he had seen to his traps, he had returned to the shed and found to his surprise that his daughter had vanished. As he told the police about his frantic search and how he had waded into the river to look for her, he even managed to shed 1 or 2 tears. They found his story credible, even though Morse had related no such tale to his own family when he had returned home that evening, and they let him go. The following day, Morse joined the police to help them search for his missing daughter, and in the afternoon, the drowned body of the 12-year-old was found half submerged in the river, tangled in the low-lying branches of an overhanging tree. 2 Scotland Yard detectives travelled down from London to lead the investigation, and a few days later they brought Morse in for questioning. This time he came up with a different story, claiming that he and Doris had made a suicide pact and thrown themselves into the river together. Doris had been swiftly carried away by the fast-moving current, but the shock of immersion in the icy water had brought Morse to his senses, and he had hauled himself out onto the bank. He claimed that he had tried to find his daughter and had searched until darkness fell, but could find no trace of her. Morse may have hoped that this convoluted tale would help him escape the noose, but the law at the time stated that a survivor of a suicide pact had, by definition, committed murder, and he was arrested the moment he put pen to paper and signed the statement. There was some controversy over the fact that the statement was grammatically perfect and contained no spelling errors, which led to speculation that the poorly educated Morse had been manipulated into signing it, but the statement was considered admissible in court. Under the Poor Prisoners Defence Act, a barrister was chosen to represent Morse at the country's expense, and Joshua Caswell travelled from London to Somerset, filled with apprehension about the task that lay ahead. Morse's only hope would lie in attacking in some way the authenticity of his statement to the detective inspector. He wrote in his memoirs later. In short, Morse had very little hope of acquittal. Morse gave a disagreeable account of himself in the witness box, appearing sullen in manner and uncouth in appearance, tramping into the courtroom in his muddy gumboots and breeches, having made no attempt to smarten himself up for the proceedings. When questioned, he insisted that his first statement was true and claimed the Scotland Yard detectives had made up the story about the suicide pact and forced him to sign it. During the prosecution's cross-examination, the surly incestophile changed his tune once again, claiming that he had found Doris's body on the afternoon of her death after all, which didn't help his case, as it proved that all the time he had been talking to the Somerset police and assisting in the search, he had known perfectly well that she was dead and where her body could be found. "Why didn't you tell the police that you had found the body?" the judge demanded sternly. Frederick Morse did not reply. Next, his mother Alice was called to the stand to give evidence against her son, and testified about his demeanour on the day Doris went missing. She wept as she told the truth about his behaviour, having always suspected deep down that he had something to do with his daughter's disappearance. The jury found Frederick Morse guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to hang. He was remanded to Bristol prison, where he refused to see any of his family members, but wrote one letter to his mother. The warders were accustomed to seeing prisoners in the condemned cell becoming despondent as they awaited death, but they were astonished that Morse seemed happy and had a strong appetite. On his last night on earth, the executioner came to peer at him through the Judas hole in the cell door, which was intended to allow them to assess the prisoner's physical features so they could accurately prepare the noose without inconveniencing the condemned man. The following morning, Morse enjoyed breakfast and a cup of tea while almost 200 people congregated outside the prison gates. Hangings in England had not been open to the public since 1868, but executions nonetheless attracted a significant amount of morbid curiosity. That day, Doris's classmates were set to go on their annual school outing to Weston-super-Mare. Their jollity and excitement a poignant contrast with the scene of devastation in the cottage of Mr. and Mrs. Morse, who were to lose the second member of their family that year, one having killed the other, and the murderer now to face justice. At 8 a.m. on Tuesday 25th of July 1933, high-profile hangman Albert Pierrepoint pulled the lever and launched Frederick Morse into eternity, thus concluding the murderous career of the deviant 33-year-old. At exactly 6 minutes after 8 a.m, a small door in the main prison gates creaked open and two officials stepped out and affixed a formal notice to the wall which announced that justice had been carried out. Several people in the crowd surged forward to read the notice, having read about the crime with horror. The newspapers had downplayed the more obscene aspects of the case, and no mention had been made of the incestuous nature of the Morse family, so one can only imagine that had the public known the full story, more of the observers may have been eager to check that Pierrepoint had indeed permanently dispatched Morse from the world, relegating him to a repellent side note in the history books. Thank you for listening to Prash's Murder Map. If you're interested in vintage crimes, you might enjoy some of my other episodes, particularly my Penny Dreadfuls collections from the Victorian era. There are currently 3 for you to check out, as well as episodes on Jack the Ripper, the Brides in the Bath murders, the Axeman of New Orleans, the Ratcliffe Highway murder, and many others, plus cases from more modern times. You can find all the links in the description box below. The show is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so your support is really appreciated. Please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, or leave me a comment or review. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you again soon.